The early morning announcement that reshaped the day. It started at 7:00 on a winter morning when the air around the palace felt sharp and fragile. The sort of morning when even the lamps lining the Mall appeared to pause in silence. Most of London had yet to wake beyond the calm embrace of dawn, but inside the communications wing, an urgent briefing had already emerged, dense with language chosen to conclude a chapter rather than postpone it. The palace press office issued a statement in 2 brief sentences that swept through like a sudden surge. After careful reflection, and with profound concern for personal welfare, senior officials confirm a major and irreversible adjustment to the public role of Princess Charlotte Helena of Westmoreland. No additional information will be provided at this stage. The wording was clinical in nature, yet heavy with implication, the kind of language that stops ordinary mornings and reorders priorities. Within moments, editors altered schedules, presenters stiffened, and the nation sensed a slow, shared shift. On the terraces of Westminster, a woman folded her newspaper and murmured that the palace never spoke in such terms unless something had been lost. In a small cafe near Kensington High Street, a barista read the bulletin aloud and saw the queue at the counter fall into silence. Across the Atlantic, dawn presenters blinked as the headline crossed their screens before they turned breathlessly to speculation. What had occurred to a young princess of the modern monarchy, a child the public had seen only in gentle glimpses across summer lawns and family Christmas cards? Inside Clarence House, the printed statement lay heavily on the king's desk. Charles read the phrasing again, exhaled softly, and felt the burden of duty settle like cold stone. This was not routine administration. It was a family choice encoded in institutional language, a rare moment when the palace placed private protection above public appetite. William arrived shortly after, the seriousness of the morning evident in his stance. He had argued for precision in a statement that left no room for uncontrolled interpretation. He understood how swiftly rumour could harden into belief and how difficult it was to undo a narrative once it had taken hold in the public imagination. Yet the reality behind those 2 sentences was far more complex. It reflected months of gradual accumulation, absences quietly observed by attentive aides, subtle adjustments to Charlotte Helena's routine, and a succession of evenings when curtains were drawn earlier than usual. It echoed hushed discussions in private sitting rooms where guardians admitted concern, where senior staff weighed the emotional toll of another season under an unrelenting public gaze. For those inside the household, the announcement was not a surprise. It was the unavoidable conclusion of a long and sorrowful watch. Outside the palace walls, journalists speculated and social platforms erupted with conjecture. Yet none of that noise pierced the stillness within the royal residences. Beatrice and Eugenie, who had been informed the night before, left their phones unanswered as they tried to absorb the consequences. They adored their younger sister, had watched her grow with both pride and quiet protectiveness, and now carried the heavy awareness that the institution had chosen shelter over spectacle. In the palace drawing rooms, long-serving aides moved with deliberate calm, coordinating with charities, reassessing forthcoming duties, drafting letters of reassurance for partners who would feel her absence keenly. There was a painful refinement in the way the palace handled the announcement. It did not dramatize. It did not wrap itself in emotional language. It simply relied on restraint, precise timing, measured phrasing, and a formal expression of concern to draw a boundary between what the public wished to know and what the child deserved to retain. That restraint, however, carried its own urgency. It signaled to the kingdom that something private and delicate had reached a point where silence alone could no longer shield her without decisive action. The statement effectively marked the palace stepping in before a tender truth could be reshaped into uncontrolled speculation. By late morning, a sober discussion had settled across the nation. Viewers who once approached the royal family with curiosity and affection now responded with something deeper: protectiveness. Analysts spoke of the impossible balance between raising children within an institution defined by visibility and preserving the sanctity of their emotional growth. And within the palace, the family moved into a posture of unity and care, aware that the weeks ahead would demand patience, privacy, and unwavering steadiness. For the nation, the announcement read not as scandal, but as a solemn reminder that even the most protected young lives are not immune to strain, and that true compassion, particularly from those who hold influence, sometimes looks very much like stepping back, the shadow that gathered the storm. To understand how the palace reached a moment where it could no longer remain silent, one must return to the slow-moving undercurrent that had been forming beneath the surface since early autumn. It began with small, nearly forgettable details. Princess Charlotte Helena, once bright-eyed and endlessly curious during public appearances, began retreating inward during engagements. Where she had previously held gently to her father's hand at charitable visits, she now stood further away, her gaze lowered and shoulders drawn in as if responding to a sound no one else could hear. A single change might have been dismissed as shyness, but the pattern grew gradually and painfully unmistakable. In mid-October, during a visit to a children's literacy project, observers noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she accepted a book. By the conclusion of that event, she excused herself quietly, guided away by a senior aide whose expression blended concern with urgency. The palace offered no explanation at the time. They seldom did, but William's expression afterwards, the tension around his eyes, the stillness in his voice, signaled to those who knew him that something was wrong. Anne was the first within the family to speak plainly. She had watched Charlotte Helena during a private tea gathering and noticed how the girl flinched at sudden sounds, the way she appeared to brace herself whenever nearby conversations became animated. Anne had endured her own share of public examination and possessed a keen instinct for recognizing emotional strain. "The child is not flourishing," she said quietly to Charles afterwards. And unlike many within the institution, Anne never exaggerated a concern. By late October, medical advice was sought discreetly. Specialists advised what no royal wished to hear. The princess required space, genuine and sustained space. Away from cameras, expectations, and the burden of symbolic responsibility. Her nervous system showed signs of overwhelming stress, the sort that, if left unaddressed, could shape an entire lifetime. The recommendation was unequivocal: reduce her public role immediately. William and Catherine listened with heavy stillness, as they had suspected as much. Parents often sense decline long before it becomes visible to others. Catherine, still recovering from her own challenging months, understood intimately what it meant for both body and mind to falter beneath relentless attention. The prospect of withdrawing Charlotte Helena from public view felt both devastating and essential. Yet stepping back a child born into royalty is never straightforward. Every choice must be weighed against public expectation, institutional precedent, and media interpretation. And just as the family began quietly planning how to ease Charlotte Helena into a gentler rhythm, the situation took an unexpected turn. One driven not by internal strain, but by forces beyond palace walls. In early November, American digital platforms hungry for holiday content began circulating speculative narratives about the young princess. Her recent absences, her quieter manner, her shortened appearances, all became material for dramatic commentary. One particular podcast episode suggested she was being prepared for an expanded future role amid shifting royal dynamics. Another source invented entirely new explanations for her withdrawal, each more sensational than the last. None were grounded in truth. The tipping point arrived when an influencer with a substantial following claimed Charlotte Helena was being prepared for unprecedented responsibilities. The palace observed as false narratives spread at alarming speed, seeping into British outlets and igniting debates around lineage and duty. It was a familiar cycle for the monarchy: misinterpretation hardening into speculation, speculation twisting into perceived truth. For William, this was the final warning. He understood what unchecked misinformation could do. He had seen it rewrite public memory, fracture family bonds, and create storms that took years to settle. And now, the spiraling rumours were no longer targeting adults accustomed to scrutiny. They were closing in on a child already grappling with private vulnerability. Catherine urged swift action. Anne agreed without hesitation. Even Camilla, who had learned over many difficult decades how narratives can mutate, insisted the palace intervene before the girl's well-being was consumed by the machinery of modern speculation. Thus, the groundwork for the dawn announcement was laid, not by crisis alone, but by a convergence of sorrow, protection, and the bitter recognition that in an age of relentless commentary, silence was no longer a shield. It was a risk. Inside the night, the family ended its silence. The turning point came on the night of November 26th, a night etched with frost and tension, when the palace finally acknowledged that silence had become a liability. The family gathered in the Blue Drawing Room at Windsor, a space usually reserved for formal portraits and diplomatic greetings, not familial reckoning. Yet that evening the atmosphere felt stripped of ceremony. The lamps burned low. The air held a chill that even the roaring fire could not soften. And at the centre of the room rested a single folder, thin, unremarkable, yet heavy with consequence. William was the first to speak. He had returned from a full day of engagements, but the fatigue in his eyes stemmed not from duty, but from fear. He placed the folder on the table and looked first to his father, then to his aunt. "This is no longer manageable," he said quietly. "Every hour we delay, she becomes more exposed." Charles nodded slowly. He had spent recent weeks wrestling with equal measures of sorrow and responsibility, torn between the instinct to protect his granddaughter and the duty of safeguarding an institution that had endured for centuries. "What are the alternatives?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. The folder contained a series of escalating assessments, media trend analyses, psychological guidance, and detailed accounts of how speculation was spiraling. One page traced the spread of misinformation across 4 continents, revealing how swiftly false narratives were eclipsing reality. Another documented direct inquiries from foreign press offices, asking whether the princess was preparing for new ceremonial roles. And at the very bottom lay the most troubling document, a specialist note warning that Charlotte Helena's nervous system was registering prolonged stress responses. Catherine, though still maintaining a reduced schedule, joined the meeting via secure call. Her voice, gentle yet resolute, came through the speaker with clarity. "She needs protection, not expectation," she said. "We cannot allow her to be drawn into another cycle of scrutiny. Not now, not at her age." Her words were met with a silence dense with unspoken agreement. Anne, ever the custodian of discipline and duty, leaned forward. "We have waited too long already," she said firmly. "If we do not act decisively, others will fill the silence with their own narratives, and they already have." She tapped the folder. "This is no longer speculation. It is a pattern, a coordinated surge. That means someone somewhere benefits from her being discussed, and whether intentional or not, the harm lands on her shoulders." Camilla, who had listened quietly without interruption, finally spoke. "Children do not choose the burdens placed upon them," she said softly. "But adults must choose how far they allow those burdens to grow." Her gaze drifted towards the window where the outlines of bare winter trees stood against the darkness. "If the public believes the palace is concealing something, they will press harder. We cannot allow that pressure to reach her." William exhaled slowly. "Then we make it clear," he said. "She will step back from public duties indefinitely. We will prioritize her well-being, not appearances." The statement must be firm, brief, and unmistakable. It was not an easy choice. Royal children were often protected, yes, but rarely withdrawn so completely. The public felt entitled to glimpses of them. Birthdays, school milestones, balcony appearances. That expectation had been woven into the monarchy's relationship with its people for generations. But Charlotte Helena was not a symbol to be polished. She was a child who needed quiet, not spectacle. Charles finally spoke with a tremor born of age and resolve. "We will do it at dawn," he said. No embellishment, no apology, simply the truth. His voice carried both authority and heartbreak. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that the world would allow his granddaughter's space to grow without becoming another battlefield of narratives. But hope could not match the speed and reach of modern scrutiny. As the meeting dispersed, the weight of the decision lingered in the room. Aides moved swiftly to draft the wording. Courtiers coordinated internal protocols. The clocks at Windsor ticked into the early hours, each second drawing closer to a statement that would redefine the young princess's future. Outside, winter pressed against the castle walls, indifferent to the turmoil within. And yet within that cold, the family found a single point of unity, a shared determination to protect a vulnerable child from a world that demanded too much from those too young to give it. From group games, a quiet request to leave a room when conversation became too loud. Their hearts ached not only for their sister, but for the future she might now have to rebuild without the structure of normality she once enjoyed. And then there was Charlotte Helena herself. Shielded from the public storm but not entirely untouched by its tremors, she faced a world that had shifted abruptly without her choosing. Adults spoke in hushed tones, routines altered. Her often practiced way from the palace steps was gently discouraged. Days became slower, gentler, quieter. And though she did not fully grasp the scale of what had taken place, she sensed with the instinct particular to children that something had ended. For the palace, duty required courage. For the family, love required sacrifice. But for a young girl learning to navigate her place in a world broader and louder than she could endure, this decision represented something far more profound. The fragile beginning of reclaiming a childhood that had almost slipped beyond reach. The future the palace never expected. As evening descended over London, a muted amber glow washed across the stone walls of Buckingham Palace, softening the sharpness of a day that had carried more emotional weight than any royal announcement in recent memory. The kingdom had spent the last 12 hours absorbing the news, trying to reconcile the image of Princess Charlotte Helena of Westmoreland, the poised and softly spoken child glimpsed at holidays and ceremonies, with the reality that her future had now taken an unexpected and irreversible turn. Yet, while the public wrestled with sadness and speculation, the palace shifted into something far more fragile: the work of rebuilding a young girl's life. Inside the palace's private wing, senior advisors gathered for a late briefing designed not to manage public reaction, but to reimagine the princess's long-term trajectory. The conversation was gentle but unflinching. There would be no return to the spotlight for the foreseeable future. Her public profile, once carefully nurtured through small, age-appropriate tasks, would be reduced to almost nothing. Her schooling would transition privately without press appearances. Her presence at major royal events, birthdays, national holidays, even balcony moments would be suspended indefinitely. It was not punishment, it was protection. William sat quietly at the head of the table, listening as advisors outlined what her new routines would look like. There was discussion of counselling, of creative outlets, of structured days designed to restore confidence rather than shape public perception. There was even a proposal to spend part of the winter months in the countryside where she could wake to birdsong instead of the hum of city life. A childhood reclaimed as much as any royal child could ever regain it. Still, the decisions weighed heavily on him. He had spent his life navigating the tightrope between duty and fatherhood. Now it felt as though that rope had frayed beneath him. Protecting his daughter meant stepping into a new kind of leadership, one that favoured compassion over tradition and privacy over the institution's centuries-old reliance on public visibility. His jaw tightened slightly, a small involuntary sign of the emotional calculation unfolding within him. Catherine joined him later that night in one of the palace sitting rooms where a fire crackled softly against the cold. She wore a gentle expression that carried both concern and relief. She asked whether she had done something wrong. Catherine spoke softly as she took a seat beside him. I told her no. I told her we are the ones who must do better. William nodded, swallowing the ache rising in his chest. She will heal, he said, though the words were spoken as much for himself as for her. Meanwhile, in Windsor, Charles reflected on the day's events in the solitude of his study. He spent long moments gazing at a photograph of Charlotte Helena taken several years earlier. A candid image captured during a family walk. Her expression in the photograph was animated, her eyes bright with curiosity, her cheeks flushed with the rosy warmth of childhood. The contrast between that lively image and the fragile reality of her present circumstances struck him with a father's guilt and a king's clarity. The monarchy had survived wars, abdications, scandals, and generational upheavals, but this was different. This was a reckoning with the human cost of an institution built on observation. Across the country, the palace's confirmation reshaped public understanding of what it meant to grow up royal. For many, the announcement marked a turning point, a sign that even the most rigid traditions could bend when the well-being of a child demanded it. Commentators noted the significance of a royal parent publicly prioritizing mental and emotional health. For a nation that had watched previous generations endure pressure and silence, the shift felt both overdue and quietly revolutionary. Charlotte Helena herself, shielded from the media storm, spent that evening in a calm routine. She read a book before bed. She asked when she could see her cousins again. She wondered whether her schedule the following day would include lessons, drawing, or perhaps a walk in the gardens. She did not know that thousands of people across the world were speaking her name. And for the first time in many months, the palace felt that perhaps, just perhaps, they could keep it that way. As night deepened over the royal residences, the future remained uncertain but gentler. The monarchy had redrawn its boundaries, not through ceremony or decree, but through an act of protection rarely seen in its long, complicated history. And though the road ahead would require careful steps, one truth had emerged with undeniable clarity. The well-being of a child mattered more than tradition, more than expectation, more than duty. For Princess Charlotte Helena of Westmoreland, the future was no longer a burden. It was, at last, a beginning. In moments like this, we are reminded that even behind the grandeur of monarchy, human hearts beat with the same fragility as our own. Thank you for journeying through this chapter with care. Stay watchful, stay thoughtful, and until the next story emerges from behind the palace gates, hold space for compassion.